All I think about these days, all I think about these days is getting at that goal that's in my heart. I need a reason to believe, yeah, maybe a cure for my disease.
That song is by Blaine Long. My name is Matthew Blades. Meet my friends.
Hi, it's Tim.
And Beth from the Mulhausen Group Real Estate.
We are so proud to sponsor another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It. You can catch us at tmgphoenix.com.
That's a good group of people right there. Hi, it's Matthew Blades, host of Learn from People Who Lived It. And a reminder before we get into today's show that each of these episodes is presented uninterrupted with the support of the Mulhausen Group, with the support of ASI or Advanced Systems Integrations. They design and install cutting-edge audio and visual equipment. So if you're on the IT staff or you're the IT director, please reach out to ASI. This audio visual integrator has offices in Minnesota and in Scottsdale and 2 decades of experience. And the cool thing about them, they pay real close attention to that last 5%, which is the one that drives you and I crazy. We've got a link to ASI in our show description, or you can go there yourself by visiting asi-av.com.
Welcome to another episode of Learn from People Who Lived It.
My name is Austin, and I am 22 years old.
Austin, what story are you here to share?
I'm here to talk about my journey over the last year dealing with OCD, Tourette's, and depression.
Who do you hope hears this?
I hope that any kid out there who's feeling alone, or anyone out there who is dealing with trying not to give in to their compulsions, hears this.
So our next guest is, as you heard, been on a tour for a book that he's just written. What I hope comes out, and I queued him up to this before we got really down in deep into this, was a messy conversation surrounding a few words that he just used. Before we get into it, Dr. Frank Bavacqua, good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Good to be here.
Yeah. So Austin drops these words like OCD, like Tourette's, ADHD. And these are words that people are using like crazy right now. And well, not necessarily Tourette's, but depression for sure, ADHD for sure, OCD for sure. And so I'm hoping to have a messy conversation that allows all of us to understand Austin a little bit more. Sound good?
I like it.
Perfect, yeah.
Yeah, man. So, you know us, if you've listened to the podcast before, Austin, we like to start with everybody 0 to 10. So can you give us a little bit of an idea of what your life is like from birth till about 10?
All right, birth to 10. Well, I was born prematurely. I came out really early. So I spent the first couple weeks of my life in an incubator. And that is actually something that I remember some doctors telling me could have affected, my brain early on. Growing up, I lived in Crawfordsville, Indiana, which, if you don't know, is a very small town in Indiana, for the first couple years of my life. And I remember the first compulsion I ever had was probably when I was 2, 3, 4, something like that. And I had this little toy Lego, and I had to keep the Lego's arms up at all times, or I thought that my mom was going to get hurt in some way. For me, OCD is all about this fear. It's this thing where, your brain says this really bad thing's going to happen unless you do this compulsion. And I remember as a kid, that was kind of the first memory I have of that fear just kind of paralyzing me and me thinking, I have to do this or someone I love is going to get hurt. That was really the first time. But from there, I moved to Arizona when I was pretty young. My mom got a job here in Arizona. And I grew up in Mesa, went to Mesa Public Schools, played basketball, did kid things. And around 9, 10, that's really when I started to get into poetry, actually, is when I was introduced to some poets. And I think that was around the first time that I started to feel heard, on the page. Because a lot of these poets I was reading, they were talking about anxiety, and they were talking about really, really uncomfortable things that I didn't know how to talk to the people around me about. And so I guess I kind of felt like I found this sort of safety in these books.
Did you find that, were you supported were you around a group of people that were genuinely trying to help you figure out and find a way around this? Was it that kind of an attitude? Was it like, hey, something's not quite right with Austin, let's get our head around this situation? I mean, can you walk me through a little bit of that?
Yeah, well, one thing that I've been really lucky for is my mom is actually a psychologist. She's a child psychologist. So, one thing I always kind of like to joke with her about is she's like a doctor mom, So growing up, yeah, she was very helpful. She's the first person that introduced me to cognitive behavioral therapy. And I remember going through workbooks with her when I was younger. But, early on, I definitely didn't, talk about these things with my family, my parents, the people around me, just because I was scared and I didn't really understand it, and I think that when you feel really off from the people around you, it's somewhat of a coping mechanism to try to shield yourself from other people and from, them kind of getting into all this, and I think I was trying to figure out what was going on with myself before I let other people in. But definitely I'm really lucky to have had my parents around, because I think they noticed, definitely as a kid when I started to do these things. And early on, they were trying to teach me the tools, that I needed to at least kind of manage them, and there have been a lot of ups and downs along the way, because, for me, at least, sometimes everything's going okay, at least with the OCD aspect. And then I'll hit a trigger, or some sort of intrusive thought. And then it's really hard not to stop that free fall, is what I've found.
I want to bring
Awesome.
Dr. Frank in. Yeah. Can I bring you in really quick, Dr. Frank?
I was going to bring myself in, but
bring
sure.
yourself in then, man. Bring yourself in. But I do have something I want to ask you, but go ahead.
Well, he kind of touched on it, but, a lot of times when something starts to happen to you so young, like you said, 3, 4, 5 years old, you're noticing these things. It can go a couple of different ways. You can either, go to your parents immediately and be like, Mom, Dad, something feels weird here. I don't know what's going on. You can feel like it's weird and kind of keep it to yourself. You may notice that something is going on, but you may not have the words for it because you're so young and you don't know how to articulate it. So I guess my question is, did you finally say something out loud and share, like, specifically with your parents, like, hey, something's going on here, not really sure what it is? Or did they kind of notice and bring it up with you? Like, how did that exchange of information occur the first time, if you remember?
Yeah, well, from what I remember, I don't remember much about living in Indiana when I was really young. All I remember is that first compulsion. But I do remember there was one time I was in the car with my mom going to school. And one of these compulsions that I had, I think I was probably about 7 or 8. And the compulsion was I had to put my feet up on the headrest of the seat in front of me if I was in the back seat, or I thought the car behind us was going to rear end us and hit us. And I remember putting my feet up like that. And, my mom was asking why I was doing it. And I remember saying, like, I just really feel like I have to. I wasn't like expressing the fear behind it, because I don't think I really fully understood that. I was just like, I have this feeling, alarms are going off in my head. We are going to get hit by that car. I need to do this so that this person that I love with all my heart doesn't get hurt, And I remember her kind of piecing it together, I think, from there, like saying, okay, that's anxiety. Her being like, okay, that is a compulsion, that you're doing. And I think very lucky for me that she, was already kind of trained with those various mental disorders. I don't think I really said, hey, Mom, I think this is OCD. I didn't even know what that was.
Right.
I think it was more so like, Mom, I'm really scared and it doesn't seem like I should be, but I really am. What is going on?
Yeah. I mean, like you said, lucky that she kind of has that training and was able to recognize something in you that, another parent may not be able to recognize as quickly if it was going on with their kid. The other thing that's kind of interesting, and I think that you're lucky, is, there are maybe just as many people in your mom's position who, has the training, has the knowledge, and they see something in their own kid, but that kind of human instinct denial kicks in of like, oh no, not my kid, right? Like, I work with other kids, I help other kids, that has these problems, but not my kid, right? And I think you're lucky that she kind of jumped in immediately and was willing to kind of see and recognize and accept that. And my hunch is you're a whole lot better off now for it than if it had gone, the other way. And let's pretend this doesn't exist.
Yeah. I mean, if I didn't get treatment for this, early on, or if I didn't, I think really the biggest thing was learning what it was, learning that, the tools to fight it. The one thing that she used to always tell me, and other doctors did as well, was you can think of OCD as separate from yourself. This is not your thoughts. It's not rational. This isn't you. They would always say, OCD is this other thing, and you don't listen to OCD because OCD is not in your best interest, Right. And I think hearing that, it kind of clicked. It was like, oh, okay. When I was a kid, I was like, this is the bad guy, Yeah. And this is how I beat the bad guys. I don't listen. He's trying to tell me to do these things, and I just don't listen. And I think if I didn't know that, if I didn't learn, get that education or have those tools, I probably wouldn't be here today.
Let me ask you a question so I can understand OCD a little bit more. If you were to say, okay, I'm ignoring OCD because it's not in my best interest. Are there ever times where you get burned by that then? Are there ever times where you say, I'm going to ignore this OCD tendency or compulsion, and it actually turned out to be something legit? Or, you know what I mean? I guess what I'm trying to do is get inside your head to figure out kind of how the trip happens.
Yeah. Well, usually it's trial and error,
Yeah, okay.
Like, there was, for a while, one of my really long-term compulsions as a kid was before I went to bed every night, I had to list off every single person in the world that I loved, starting with my parents, and then my brother and sister, then my best friends, and all the way down to, my teachers and the janitor at school and, the neighbor across the street who walks her dog, and it had to be in this exact order. Or I thought, if I didn't get this exact order, if I missed someone, they wouldn't think that I loved them. They would think I didn't love them. And that thought kind of terrified me. So I remember with that one, that was a really hard one to beat because it was fully internal. It wasn't a external compulsion. Like some of the compulsions are, I have to put this in the right order, or I have to put my feet on this headrest. This was completely internal, and I don't think I've ever been burned in that aspect where, oh, this is actually something to really be afraid of. Because I think that would be, if I say I disregarded an anxiety, and it was actually something to be scared of, that would really mess with my head, I think, because I've been training my brain for a while to, kind of recognize the OCD alarms. So thankfully that really hasn't happened too much.
Good.
But, the difficult part is it's exhausting. It's really hard to just fight against the thoughts, to fight against the compulsions. It drains you, it takes you out of it. And it's really much easier to give into it. It feels like in the moment, it feels a lot easier because you get this momentary satisfaction, it's super fleeting. It doesn't last very long. And then it feels a lot worse. So it's kind of like, one thing I started to think about it as when I got older was kind of like a drug, It feels a little bit better if you complete the compulsion, just a tiny bit, and then it feels a lot worse unless you do the compulsion again or go through the withdrawals, I guess, get through it and kind of train your brain to understand, like, that's not something to really be afraid of. You're safe. You're okay. It's going to be all right.
So I'm not a psychologist, but there happens to be one here. And I always love digging into Frank's brain because, listen, you guys know how the world works, right? There's a certain demographic out there, a certain group of people who they don't get it. They're like, I don't understand. Why can't you get control over your head? I don't understand. Why can't you just stop doing it? As a psychologist, and then I'd like to extend the question to you too, Austin, as somebody that lives with it day in and day out. But as a psychologist, how come some people get the thoughts and some people don't get the thoughts? I mean, is there any rhyme or reason to, who or how that seems to land on folks?
Are you talking about like who becomes afflicted with it, or who out there listening?
Well, I'll give a real life example. Yeah, like Frank's one of these guys. He's really good at you handle bad news pretty well. You're fine with it, right? You just kind of move along with it, and you're good. Some people hear the same bit of news and it sends them into orbit. Okay.
Yeah.
So is there any reason why some go to orbit and some are fine?
I mean, it's a combination. A lot of people have probably heard the phrase like nature versus nurture, right?
Okay.
How much of this is something that somebody is born with and it's kind of ingrained, or it kind of happens to them, no rhyme or reason, totally out of the blue, or maybe there's a genetic component, but nothing specifically occurred to necessarily cause it, or the nurture aspect of sometimes we learn certain reactions from people, right? The anxiety may not have been ingrained in us, but we grow up with anxious parents and think that that's kind of how we're supposed to react and deal with things. So it can really be either of those or some combination thereof. A lot of things, kind of happen to us. And then obviously there's a lot too that we kind of learn and pick up along the way. In either instance, unfortunately, the responsibility kind of falls to that person to figure out how to unlearn at least pieces of it. And I think that's what Austin's talking about, where, okay, I have all these thoughts in my head. Some are legitimate that I need to listen to, and some are the OCD talking. I now have the responsibility to figure out which ones of these I'm supposed to listen to, which ones I'm not supposed to listen to. Most of us never have to go through that process in our head of kind of questioning, am I supposed to listen to this thing or not? And that sorting process, I imagine, Austin, is kind of what you're talking about, where it's exhausting because you have to have like an extra thought about everything that comes through your head.
Yeah, you have to filter it. It's like a filter. Oftentimes it feels like there's thousands of thoughts bouncing around my head,
Yeah.
And I think the tool and the strategy is to, filter out the ones that you don't need to listen to and focus on the rational thoughts, the good ones, and that's a really hard thing to do, especially, for me at least, I deal with, various mental health issues. So along with this OCD, I do have ADD as well, and Tourette's, and for me, Tourette's is this physical pain, and it's this, bodily movement that you can't control. And sometimes that gets frustrating because your head with the OCD feels like you can't control it. And then your body, you feel like you can't control that either. And it just feels like you're just out of control of everything that you should be in control of.
Yeah.
Do you have these moments? I remember, listen, Austin, I don't know if you know this, but the whole reason this podcast started was because I felt like I hit kind of my rock bottom. I went down to the most depressed state I ever was. I didn't feel like I had any tools left. And I remember there just being moments where I felt possessed, where I didn't feel like myself. Did you experience that too?
Oh yeah. Yeah. I mean, for me at least, when I feel myself falling, I guess, getting into a bad place, okay. I've been there so many times that I feel like I can notice the warning signs, but sometimes it's really difficult. And the last couple months, it was really difficult. The last year, really, it was really hard not to keep falling. One of the metaphors that I was talking about, when I was on tour reading these poems about what I was going through, I said it kind of felt like I was climbing this mountain with my mental health. And I got to a place where I just felt too tired, too exhausted to keep climbing, even though I knew, from past experience, if I kept climbing, I'd be able to rest, and it kind of felt like I just let go in a way. And I was not taking care of myself, not sleeping very well, not eating very well. I was self-medicating, with various substances. And that was the most difficult, I think, is it all started to kind of pile on itself.
If you guys don't mind, I'd like to just backtrack a tiny little bit, because something you said earlier, I think is worth discussing, Austin. You said, I was trying to gather myself together before I talked about it. And so I love this point of discussion. So Dr. Frank, Austin, let's talk about it. A lot of times in life, and we can all look back at our own stuff, we sat there for days, maybe weeks, maybe months, maybe years, trying to figure out what the fuck we wanted to say before we talked about it to anybody. And in that time, ruined a lot of relationships, ruined a lot of friendships, ruined a lot of situations, because while we were sitting there trying to figure it out before we wanted to say anything, this whole thing was happening. So don't you kind of feel like that's worth chatting about?
I know that's definitely been the case for me, because oftentimes I feel like I want to be able to understand what's going on in my head before I let other people in on that, But I found that's not the right strategy. For me, at least, it's best just to be honest and vulnerable about what I'm going through, to the people that I love, the people around me, and then you have a team. Then you have a team of people who can help you, navigate that really uncertain and strange terrain. And I think that there have been times, where I wasn't honest, about what was going on, or I tried to kind of make sure other people thought that I was okay. And it ended up just kind of either creating, a wall between people and myself, or distance, or just hurting relationships. So that's something that I've just learned over the years. It's better for me, I guess, just to be honest.
I mean, Matthew, you and I, for all the people that we've gotten to talk to, it seems like so much of the time by the end of that person's story, we hear a very similar message, right? Like, man, if I had just talked to my sister-in-law 10 years sooner, we could have avoided this whole thing. Or if I had just been open and honest about this thing that I was going through, right? There seems to be this common theme of, Austin, like this openness and honesty that ultimately turns out better than the anxiety that we built up in our head, and why we kind of keep it to ourselves. My question for you, though, is that there are a lot of people who, whatever sort of internal demons they're battling, technically they can hide those things, right? They can keep those things to themselves much of the time. And so when they meet new people in particular, they can hide those things or keep them a secret for a little while if they choose to. For you, I imagine, especially with the Tourette's, right? Like it's kind of out there. It's a little harder for you to keep those things to yourself, specifically when you're meeting somebody new. How did you wrap your head around being so open and honest with strangers? Because most of us don't want to do that. And if I'm understanding your situation correctly, you kind of have to do that. And how do you wrap your head around that?
For me, it was liberating in a way. It all started for me, I think, when I was in 8th grade. That was the first time I ever tried slam poetry. And for me, I would write these poems and I wouldn't show them to anyone, or I'd write these stories or these songs and I would just hide them. And then one day, there was a teacher who said, "Hey, you should read this out loud to someone." And I gave it a shot. And the poem was about how I was feeling anxious, as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, whatever. And it was very simple, but it was about that emotion that I hadn't expressed to anyone really. And I remember there were other kids in the class who said later, like, "Hey, I was feeling anxious a couple days ago, and like, are you all right?" And I guess that was kind of a key moment for me. It was like, wow, I'm not the only one going through this. There are kids who sit 5 feet away from me who are experiencing something similar, or something that we can both kind of find shared ground in, I guess.
Yeah.
And, as I got older and I started to want to pursue writing and social work, activism, I thought, I think that we can flip this and use this pain or the demons or whatever we want to call it as a way to heal internally and also collectively, and that's one way that I, help myself through whatever I'm going through is I talk about it. I talk about it on, radio shows, interviews, through my poetry, and just be completely open and honest. And I think that's how we bridge a lot of these gaps. I know that growing up, especially I think in schools, it's kind of talked about, you don't talk about your feelings, don't tell the teacher, maybe don't tell the people around you, just kind of like, you're okay, you're happy, just be happy. And I think that one thing I've been trying to do more recently, and something that I've learned from more teachers growing up, is, we need more mental health education in schools. And I think that could be really, really just crazy helpful for a lot of kids if they knew, these are the resources, this is why you're feeling this way, these are other kids who are going through something similar. That's just something kind of I've learned throughout the years.
All right, friends, we're going to hit the pause button right there. If you want to join us for part 2, go for it right now. But when you come back, you are going to get an unbelievable look into the life of somebody with Tourette's. Plus, we are going to be, oh my God, I'm so excited about this, unbelievably blessed with some slam poetry as written by Austin. You don't want to miss part 2. We'll see you when you're ready.